Hey everyone, welcome to this session for the Festive Tech Calendar. So I'm Joël Lebert, super excited to do a session on API standards and how I break them apart with MindMapping. I got my friend Bit, he's looking very Canadian, he's on a toboggan. All he's missing is some maple syrup, a Pepsi, maybe a Vachon cake, and a beaver tail. He'd be super Canadian right now, but guess what else is really Canadian? We got a lot of snow today, so I'm not sure if you can see, but outside it's looking super festive, and you know where else it's gonna look super festive? Right on the screen. So first things first, so I wanted to do a session. It's not something you can peruse on the internet and immediately find, right? It's just a technique that was developed and whatnot. So a lot of times when I do my sessions, it's not about things that you can find on a blog post or whatnot easily. It's something that comes from real world experience. So I want to share with you how I usually go when I'm doing consulting gigs and whatnot, and I'm breaking down the client's API standards. I use a mind mapper and I cross-correlate that with other things like the OWASP REST cheat sheet. And that usually makes the task of learning all these different API standards a lot easier and a lot easier to I guess retain, because once you start reading a lot of different specs, you're working on 4 different clients at the same time. It's very difficult to try to remember everything, but once you have that mind map, it kind of sets a visual for you. So without further ado, what we'll do is we'll just put that mindset, right? So when you're actually working towards building an API and you're just building a client. So for example, here is the Twitter API. So it's very simple here. I can build some clients. I can use some generators off Swagger Hub and whatnot. So this is like the standard search API. I can get a feel for it here. I can see the nomenclature, how it, if it's using verbs or not, if it's using the correct elements, JSON versus XML, tells me about the resource information and whatnot. So it's pretty easy to do that API discovery and then start working towards a client. I can generate the client, which I like doing, gives a better look and feel, saves a lot of time. But what about when you have to actually create these APIs, right? So you could head into 2 different situations. You could go to a government organization. They're very established. The standards are there and whatnot. It's just for you to learn them. Or you could be working with a new organization and then you have to kind of do a lay of the land and do an API landscape for them and discover what the API standards should be for that organization, and then propagate that and have that part of your culture so that the different teams have a common look and feel to your API. So I'll give you an example. So here, when we're trying to build a client, just go on Twitter or on any other provider and you kind of take a look at the API and then you're building the client. But when you have to actually create APIs, so I'll just go here. So for example, I live in Canada. So here's an example here, Government of Canada. So they have a standard on API. So they've done this with as a conglomerate with other countries. So if you actually search some of these terms, you'll find them on other specs for these large government organizations. So essentially what it does, it tells you when you're going to be building things for the Government of Canada, either as an employee or as a contractor, what are the sort of standards and design principles you're going to adhere to, right? So they have the large lines: follow the Government of Canada, digital standards, design with the user. So there's some of the pragmatics to working with the design. And then building RESTful APIs, use the JSON, don't overload verbs. But you're seeing here that I'm not going to be memorizing this my first day on the job when I have to build APIs for them, right? Avoid generic open schemas, consume what you build, secure the API. Okay, so now we're getting into more fine-tuned elements. But if I were to read this document, do a one pass, I'm not going to memorize everything. And if I want to start, hit the ground running and impress the client and whatnot, I found that breaking these up in small pieces based on an API standard in a mind map works perfect for me. So, and the reason I usually do this is, for example, if you take a look here, there's some things related to API lifecycle. So I'll break these into the API lifecycle pieces. There's some that are for the date time, so that can be part of your API standard. And then you have some that talk about protecting the API, and at places they'll have places on how to return the values, but you see they're all in different places, right? So I usually assemble them, what's important for the CI/CD pipeline, for the life cycle, for the standards, right? For DevSecOps. I break it up in those pieces. I'll show you the technique and hopefully it's something. So basically, if you take a look at this document that's here, I've actually broken that down into this document here. So this is a mind map, so it's a little hard to see now. So what we'll do is we'll zoom in. So I've broken it down into different pieces, right? So you see here, there's like API design standards. For example, I talked about that API lifecycle. So I've broken that. I've went into that document, pulled everything out and put it here in a way that's more concise for me. And especially if you're working with multiple different clients and you have to build in different ways. If you're actually doing more than one client a day, 2 to 3, they're going to have different standards. You want to have something in plain sight for you that's easy to understand. So I'll give you a quick example of how you can take those pieces and break them apart. So take a look here. So we have use HTTP headers, right? So this could easily go into the HTTP header section. But what about this piece here? The API key must be passed in the header rather than the URI. So we have two different constructs here. We have a security construct, and we have one that's related to API standards saying, well, you're probably going to have to pass in an API key, right, in the header. So the OCP subscription that you have with Azure API Management, that should be mandatory, right? And it probably should be set not in the URI as it's stating here, and be part of, a header. When you do send it as part of URI, the main issue is it gets put into the logs, right? Especially on those GET requests. So then you start looking in logs and application insight. You can actually see at times some of those production keys. So that's definitely a no-no. So then I usually go and augment with something else. So basically going to OWASP. Okay, so the Open Web Application, forget the last thing. I just called it OWASP. So notice here, there's a section on API keys here on the REST security cheat sheet. So it'll tell you here what it would like to see as part of the guidance. So require API keys for a request to the protected endpoint. Okay, so similar to the other standard. It's also giving you some more elements here. So basically on rate limiting, 429 too many requests. We see this in Azure API Management. It does it automatically for you. You just have to set what the parameters are for that rate limiting. And revoke the API key for the client. So revoke, does that mean I revoke as the administrator, or the client can revoke himself, right? So if the client, the API gets popped, wants to basically shut it down, can he go and revoke that key and break those credentials if they've been compromised and somebody else is using them? Or is it solely up to you as the admin, as Azure API Manager? So if I take a look here at the breakdown that I did, so you see here, there was a section here on headers, and I put down the OCP APM subscription key because that's what I work with, the main stack, Azure API Management. And from the OWASP REST cheat sheet, require an API for every request. And from that standard, the Canadian standard, the keys tokens must be secured separately and whatnot. And if I go down to another slight area over here, so we're just going to slide over. So you notice here in API keys tokens must be securely set up and used appropriately. So that goes into play with what the OWASP REST cheat sheet said here, return to 429. So the API appliance will do that. API tokens must be securely set up and used appropriately. That's left up to an appliance. So what we do is we go up and we take a look at what the appliance should do for us, right? We're not going to reinvent the wheel here. So definitely Azure API Management can do client-based revocation, right? So if the client thinks that the keys are compromised, can go and revoke that. I can go as an admin and revoke the keys as well. I can issue multiple keys per client. I can put a policy to evaluate the presence and validity of the key, right? So I can put that's done automatically in the API Manager. If you don't send a key, well, you're going to get an error. There's integrated messaging, right? So the 429, I'm not coding that. The API Manager will do that for me. And it does support header-based key transport. So perfect. So we know that we have the capability and whatnot. So that's just one way that I basically go about and break the different elements. So Another one that's interesting here is I don't have that in the spec, but what I know from utilizing Azure API Management and Azure Functions and API apps, and have been doing this for a long time, is there are leaky headers. So when you're using API Management, there's an X powered by, and there's also a server variable that you don't want to share. And there's also, I think, X forwarded for that gives the IP address of whatever it was forwarded for. We don't want to leak those out. So usually in API Management, I have a process that will remove those. Once you're using security tooling against your APIs, they will flag these as headers that you should remove. There's quite a few good sessions on the internet on those, but it's up to you to take a look at them and discover them. So another example I wanted to give was on this section here. So for example, build well-defined, easy to consume message schemas. And if we take a look at standardized error codes, so as part of any API standard and whatnot, standardizing the error codes is very important, right? Whoever's going to work with your standards wants to have that common look and feel. I know I'm going to get back a 200 OK in this situation, a 201. I know I'm going to get back, for example, 404s, any large type error. This is what I'm dealing with, and this is what I have to basically adhere to. For this one, if I go to the REST cheat sheet and cross correlate, right? So it does talk about error handling and how to bring the errors back, but it doesn't tell you exactly what the error codes that you should bring back. That's up to you to do a design decision on, but it does talk about error handling. So those two are related and should be encompassed together, right? So here we've got something telling you respond with a generic message. Don't give too many details, and especially don't give any details like stack traces about what you have. If the client wants to know more, ask them for a correlation ID, and then you can work with them on a resolve. So definitely never passing any technical details, just telling the partner what the error is, and then with the other segment that I just showed you, what's the pragmatics and what's the design principles behind it. So those you can definitely have those inside of your versions here. And then if you take a look at those status codes, right, you can do a 405 method not allowed. So we looked at what to send back when there's an error, but also when you are receiving elements. That's the flip side to it. The HTTP status codes, you can throw a 405 method not allowed and start defining how that API is going to react and exist, right? So lastly, as I usually break down these API standards and whatnot, I try to take a look at what I've seen in the past. So for example, the API lifecycle. So that's something I can put into my own mind map. So this one very much related to API patterns, pagination, internationalization, security, statelessness, the way that you can search, the response message, right? So we just talked about that. HTTP methods, leaky headers. We have another segment on headers, schemas, error handling, HTTP status codes, versioning, RESTful APIs, date formats, bulk data sets, API definitions, localization, right? So that formulates a pretty good API design standard. So when I'm coming in to do that discovery, instead of reading that document and then I'm off to do the work, it's very difficult for me to retain everything. I can hit this document up and look at it, and then as I'm working with the date format, I know I'm supposed to use an ISO 8601. I know what the format's supposed to be. I know that I'm supposed to use a 405 method not allowed. I know that I'm cross-correlating with the OWASP REST cheat sheet, so I'm following some best practices. But then as I'm going through that other document, I'm able to take a look at some of the finer lines in the different groupings, like this API lifecycle here, right? So when something goes wrong with the API, what's the point of contact? How does versioning work, right? What's the major, minor, and the patch? How does feedback work with the API manager, right? Versioning updates, how does that look? The documentation for the API, right? So that'll be part of some of the API lifecycle. When you release, what are you going to release? Some notes on what was fixed, what was changed? Or are you going to do different things? That's part of that API lifecycles. Another one is Sometimes it's not always in the spec, but you can do here the what's needed in the CI/CD pipeline. So sometimes some of the partners will tell you what you need to do for DevSecOps, but definitely TDD is very important. So as you're building out those APIs, is it mandatory to run those unit tests while you're building, running those integration tests while you're doing that TDD on releases or you're doing continuous deployment? But one element I think is very important, especially in API development, are integrated tooling. Great tool out there. So if you're doing static analysis, so examples of Sonar Cube and Veracode are very good elements there. Dynamic, that's basically opening up the source code and taking a look at it and seeing what kind of security issues there are. The dynamic elements for API, looking at companies like Sapiens.io. Another one, not super, I wouldn't consider it dynamic, but it does a contract evaluation called Crunch42 if you want to look at it. For APIs is very good. And lastly, a Veracode can do some type of dynamic scans. More adapted towards web, but can be adapted. You could maybe put in fuzzing here, like the new Microsoft REST, I think it's called Restless. They just released it. It's their API fuzzer. Could utilize that. I like adding SSL tests, so it can tell me when my endpoints are healthy or not. It can tell me all those different type of things. Some unit tests, so some negative unit tests, and then component scans. So software composition analysis is very important. So you have the OWASP dependency check for that, and you also have tools like White Source, will actually break apart the pieces that you utilize to build out those APIs. All that you can actually integrate it here. So here's an example of something that was not in that API standard, but having worked in the industry, that's part of a full-fledged CI/CD pipeline where you have to integrate security. So I just go basically in it and put that in there, so it drives conversation and thought. Give you another example on the API auditing and logging. So based on the standards that the client had, they had some constructs for runtime performance, auditing, and activity tracking. So the reason why I wanted to share this technique here is it's done wonders for me in breaking up standards for clients. And that's a technique that I wanted to share because at first I took that API standard, the large government of Canada one, I broke it down into Excel and it became quickly unmanageable. So when I was able to say, okay, actually, what are the larger lines, right? What are these larger constructs? Break it down. What are the standards? What decision points do I need to take? What's the monitoring? The SLA, DevOps, break it down into different pieces, put them down into mind maps, and then after that, when you have to reference them, it's quite easy. Then you have a nice a segment here. So let's say that you are working with a new team and you have to make some decisions on what type of design standards you're going to implement. You could then compare the design standards here of, like, example, Government of Canada, Government of New Zealand, you could go to the UK or whatnot, and it's actually in a more representable form than you just going down and reading all those elements. So that's essentially my technique. So I just wanted to take a good 15 to 20 minutes and share that with you. So it's brought me a lot of success and allowed me to work with ease and reduce my stress, right? When I had it in Excel, that was not so fun. So not bashing it as a tool, but as a way to do the API discovery and then breaking down into these building blocks. I would highly recommend you mind map. Go ahead, take that standard, break it down, cross-correlate with the OWASP cheat sheet, cross-correlate with other standards if you want to challenge things, if you want to make those key decisions on what the HTTP return codes are, how you're going to do versioning and whatnot. If it's mandated by the client, so be it. If you are the client, well, evidently the API is already created and you're going to utilize whatever versioning scheme they have. And then if you are creating a brand new a standard, it's up to you to make those design decisions, but having it in a mind map, you can pull those different elements and then make those key decisions with the team. On that, wishing you a happy festive holidays. And if I look outside, I've got a nice evergreen, so I'm gonna have to put some nice I guess some nice lights in there, and wish you guys all a great festive holiday. And I think I'm gonna go warm up some maple syrup, put it on the snow, and make some French Canadian taffy, and wish you all the best. Thank you. I've been watching all your videos and different elements, and on that, thank you very much for watching. Joël Hébert, and have a great one. Cheers.